This recording is for paying patients for their tissue, the legacy of Henrietta Lacks. Human cells, most commonly used worldwide since the mid-1950s for studying biological processes, originated from one individual, a woman from Virginia, Henrietta Lacks. In 1951, she was diagnosed with an extremely fast-growing form of cancer. Without her knowledge, researchers harvested some of these unusually durable cells known as HeLa, which identifies the source, and began to share them with other scientists from a wide variety of research. Eventually, tens of thousands of patients involving HeLa cells were granted patents. Sorry, I said patients. Eventually, tens of thousands of patents involving the HeLa cells were granted, representing numerous valuable products. Henrietta, meanwhile, succumbed to her cancer. She passes away, and her family continues to live in poverty. In the 1990s, Henrietta's family learned that millions of dollars had been made as a result of research done with Henrietta's cells. Again, it was done without Henrietta's consent or knowledge. Her case inspired a best-selling book by Rebecca Skloot and sparked a wide-ranging social debate over the ethics and rights involved in the use of an individual's genetic material. In this paper, the authors argue some key points and describe a decision reached in the case of another patient. Keyword here, argue. So as we're reading, which statements are central ideas? Which are claims? They're arguable. Where's our thesis statement? Henrietta Lacks. Unknown to her, Henrietta Lacks provided scientists with crucial research tool. While undergoing unsuccessful treatment for cervical cancer in 1951, her doctor removed cells from her cervix, hoping to create an endless, self-renewing supply of human cells to study diseases and test drugs. Previous attempts to grow such a supply of human cells, called a cell line, had failed. But Henrietta's cells thrived. Named HeLa after their donor, the cells were used to create the polio vaccine and to test treatments for Parkinson's disease and leukemia. Henrietta's family did not learn about her gift to neuroscience research until decades later. We have lots of words for this reading. Intuition, perception made without significant evidence or intellectual consideration. Lucrative, profit. Wealth. Quantify, to measure the quantity of something. Articulate, state in words. Inequity, being unequal or unjust. Resonates, intensify and enrich the significance of something. Precedent, an action or event that is considered as an example, model, or guide for future actions. This is going to be pretty important when we look at the court cases. Salient, most prominent or obvious. Incremental, increasing in a regular species or sequence. Residual, remaining after most of the quantity or material is gone. Entail, impose or require. Inherit, occurring or existing as a critical part. Build upon, built in or essential. Procure, obtain with care or with effort. That's going to be an important word. And to determine whether money is provided or not. Procure. Did you have to get it with great care or with great effort? Acquisition, act of obtaining or purchasing. Plausible, credible, probable, believable. Rational, explanation of the reasons for a course of action. Mitigate, to lessen the effect or force of. Reconceptualize, to redevelop an idea or concept. Paradoxically, in a manner that appears to contradict but could be true. incentivize to provide with motivation or encouragement. That's going to be an important word. Was there an incentive attached? Extrinsic, appearing or developing because of an outside force. Intrinsic, naturally appearing or developing internally. Altruistically, characterized by an unselfish respect for or commitment to other individuals. Ostensibly, a way that seems outwardly true, manifestly, in a way that is obvious or easy to identify and understand. So lots of words. Don't hesitate to come back to this vocabulary section at any point if you're like, I need to go back and look at that word again. Keep in mind as we're reading, there is always more than one side to an argument. It's up to us to weigh the facts and evidence to determine our own thoughts and beliefs. Paying patients for their tissue, the legacy of Henrietta Lacks. The intuition that tissue donors are owed financial compensation is mistaken as a matter of policy and ethics. Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, Rebecca Skloot tells the moving story of a woman who was the source of the first immortal cell line, HeLa. The cells were obtained at Johns Hopkins University in 1951 from biopsies performed during her treatment for cervical cancer. Her physicians did not seek her consent before using her tissue for research, nor did they receive any personal financial gain from the cell line. Biopsy, so they took some of the tissue. Cervical cancer is a type of cancer. So what is the specific problem, the lack of consent, when considering the use of Ms. Lack's tissue? The cells were obtained without her consent, but those doctors, those physicians, so they did not ask, but they did not get any money from this. So what specific problem does the lack of consent, since they didn't ask, present? They just took those cells. They did not ask. What is an issue or problem with that? So 1951, Henrietta Lacks, we got the cells. Look at all of the things that have come because of those cells. The polio vaccine. They learn about HPV, HIV identification. Over 60,000 research papers. We get the first HeLa genome. It all started back here with Henrietta Lacks. The cell line did become extremely lucrative, so it did eventually provide lots of money. However, although it is difficult to precisely quantify the total revenue generated from the HeLa line, it is not unreasonable to assume that the line has contributed to hundreds of millions of dollars in downstream revenue. Hundreds of patents contain the word HeLa in their claims, and genetically modified versions of the line currently sell for as much as $10,000. So while the physicians in Henrietta didn't get rich, somebody is making money off of this cell line. For many, it seems an injustice that the Lacks family never received any financial benefits from the HeLa line, especially given that they lived in poverty, unable to pay even for their own medical care. Christopher Langauer, a cancer drug developer and former Hopkins faculty member, articulated the sense of inequity when he reportedly told Lack's daughter that he thought Hopkins had screwed up by not sharing some of the proceeds from the HeLa line with the Lacks family. Although this sentiment resonates with a sense of fairness for many people, it requires critical examination before becoming accepted as a precedent regarding payment to patients. That is going to be an important sentence. Well, It seems really nice and thoughtful for us to say that. We have to really examine the situation closely because it could set precedent regarding how all people are paid in the future. This paragraph presents the thesis statement of the article. It examines whether patients should be paid for donating tissue for research. We recently had an opportunity to consider the issues surrounding sharing revenues with patients who provided tissue for research when a young man we will call DF was treated at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute for a rare metastatic malignancy. So we talked about Henrietta. We're changing direction here. We're talking about DF and the case of DF. Shortly before he died, he was admitted to the hospital with increasing shortness of breath, requiring placement of a pleural drainage catheter. With his knowledge and permission, the physician investigators obtained discarded fluid from the catheter to obtain and isolate tumor cells. With his knowledge and permission, notice that's different than the case with Henrietta Lacks. The cells were processed into a cell line that holds promise for basic science research and the development of therapeutics. The line may result in a revenue stream for medical center as well as personal income for the physician investigators. After the patient died, the physician investigators who cared for him were motivated to see that the family received some financial benefit for his contribution. So the physician said, yeah, we need to pay this man for his contribution. Again, that's a different approach than what we saw in the case of Henrietta Lacks. They sought advice from the Research Ethics Consultation Service at the Harvard Clinical and Translational Science Center on which we serve. So here you can see how metastasis happens. When it metastasizes, it goes to other parts of the bodies. If a patient owns their tissue, even after removal from their bodies, then it follows that they have a right to demand payment when a profitable discovery derives from them. One of the earliest cases addressing this question was Moore versus Regents of the University of California. John Moore, so again, we're looking at another case, had his spleen removed as part of his treatment for hairy cell leukemia. Several years later, he initiated a lawsuit after learning that his physician at the University of California, Los Angeles, had developed a lucrative cell line, MO, from this tissue. At the time, Moore predicted a market value of around $3 billion. In 1990, the California Supreme Court decided that Moore did not have a property interest. So the court said, nope. Once those cells were removed, you had no property interest, worrying that giving property rights to patients would hinder research by restricting access to necessary raw materials and might destroy the economic incentive to conduct important medical research. Most other legal precedent supports the view that patients do not maintain a property interest in discarded tissue. So that's important. They're saying the law says, nope, it's discarded tissue. You have no legal claim to it. Once it's discarded, it's no longer yours. Therefore, you have no right to compensation, which means you get paid nothing. This graphic shows you where the spleen's located. And how blood cells develop and transport through the body, and the difference between healthy blood and blood with cancer. Even if the patients lack such property rights, there are examples of individuals receiving financial compensation for donating tissue. A striking case was Ted Slavin, again, a different man, different case, a man with hemophilia who developed extremely high antibody titers after contracting hepatitis B. When his physician informed him that his blood might be valuable to medical researchers, he was able to sell his serum for as much as $10,000 per liter, providing himself with a source of income for the rest of his life. Are the Moore or Slavin cases relevant to those of lax or DF? What are the salient features that determine whether a patient should be paid for their tissue? That's the question. So here is a graphic that shows the difference between normal blood vessels and blood vessels of somebody who has hemophilia. Investigators' obligations to individuals from whom they seek tissue for research. There are 3 distinct obligations that an investigator who seeks access to tissue might have toward an individual whose tissues, upon removal from the body, might hold value for biomedical research. There's a table. We're going to look at that table next. And in addressing each of these obligations, it's necessary to distinguish between situations in which the tissue constitutes excess material that remains after an indicated clinical procedure, and those in which obtaining the tissue imposes incremental inconvenience, burden, or risk. That's the important piece. Was it inconvenient? Was it a burden? Was there a risk? Here's our chart. Residual clinical tissues. You should have consent. Tissue collection requiring additional interventions. In both cases, there should be consent. Now look at this. Compensation for effort. Residual clinical tissues, no compensation. Tissue collection requiring additional interventions. That's the burden, inconvenience, risk. You should be compensated. Both cases, rights to revenue streams derived from that. In both cases, they're saying no, you should not get paid if your cells prove to be of value and generate an income and profit later. You are entitled to none of that. Consent. Residual clinical tissues, such as those at issue in the case of DF, are obtained as a byproduct of necessary care. That's the important piece. Necessary care involve no increased potential harm or discomfort for the patient and entail no extra effort or inconvenience beyond that inherent in the patient's medical treatment. Although consent is not always required for the use of residual clinical tissue, as with de-identified tissues obtained from pathology department archives, current U.S. regulatory standards require investigators to obtain the individual's consent whenever they prospectively intend to use residual clinical tissue for research. Of course, investigators must also obtain informed consent when undertaking additional procedures beyond necessary clinical care to procure tissues for research. Compensation for effort and burden. By definition, the use of residual clinical tissue for biomedical research imposes no additional effort, burden, or risk on the patient. As a result, no compensation for such effort is owed. By contrast, when the procurement of the tissue imposes burdens over and above those required for indicated clinical care, it may be necessary to offer individuals, whether patients or healthy volunteers, compensation. Ample precedent exists for offering payment when individuals are asked to cooperate with physicians or investigators for the benefit of others. For example, in research contexts beyond that of tissue acquisition, subjects are commonly compensated for the time, effort, and cooperation that participation requires. So time, effort, cooperation. Notice Time, effort, cooperation, not the actual tissue. They're compensated for time. They're paid for their time, their effort, cooperation. Similarly, payments are often made when renewable tissues are procured from volunteers, not for their medical benefit, but solely for the benefit of others. So if there's no benefit to the person donating, this is reflected in markets that exist for blood and blood derivative, oocytes, sperm, and breast milk. Although many individuals do not demand payment for these tissues, as reflected in a largely voluntary supply of banked blood, it is widely acknowledged that, as in the case of Ted Slavin, individuals may seek payment for these renewable tissues. In light of the Moore decision and other legal precedents, holding that individuals do not retain property ownership over removed tissues. So, removed tissues. You do not maintain ownership according to legal terms. We suggest that a plausible rationale for justifying such payments is that they are made in exchange for the performance of a service. So, service, time, effort, inconvenience. So, you're paying for the service rather than the transfer of property, rather than the product or tissue. Rights to revenue streams. Cases such as Lax and DF pose the question of whether investigators and institutions owe individuals payment for the potential value of the tissue, and in particular, whether contributors should have rights to a portion of any revenue stream that derives from their tissue. As discussed, neither legal norms nor contemporary practice treat tissues that have been separated from the body as ongoing property. So once the tissue is removed from your body, you no longer maintain ownership under the law, such that it would generate a revenue stream. Nevertheless, beyond legal duties, do ethics require that individuals whose tissues ultimately provide revenue for institutions and investigators be offered a share of the proceeds? That's the question. Blood derivative and oocytes. Those are cells, egg cells. So whole blood, packed red blood cells, platelets, fresh frozen plasma, all of those are blood products. Several considerations mitigate against the claim that patients such as Lax and DF should be offered financial compensation for the use of the residual clinical tissue. First, although it is true that the patients have contributed raw materials necessary for the development of cell line, it is the investigators, not the patients, whose intellectual contributions led to the creation of value. So it's not the cells, but the investigators who figured out what to do with the cells that are responsible for the discovery. Second, paying such individuals raises questions of fairness. Investigators may preferentially reward patients and families with whom they have an emotional bond, but not those who were equally generous but with whom personal relationships were absent. So they're worried that emotion might make it unfair. It wouldn't be equal compensation. Third, the implications of reconceptualizing tissue acquisition as an economic exchange rather than a gift relationship must be carefully considered. Payment might paradoxically have a negative effect on patients' willingness to give their tissues for research. Providing upfront payments to all patients who donate tissue, independent and without prior knowledge regarding the actual financial value of their contributions, suggests that payments themselves would likely be quite modest. The enormous number of tissue samples collected, as compared with the relatively small number that acquire significant value, suggests that the prior estimate value of any given tissue sample is low. Such small payments might not merely fail to incentivize patients, but might actually be scorned as an unfair or token reward. In addition, there is a risk that invoking such extrinsic extrinsic motivation of money would crowd out intrinsic motivations, such as the desire to contribute altruistically to improve knowledge and treatment. So here the author suggests that if everyone is paid to donate tissue, this could actually discourage people who might donate for reasons other than money, such as compassion and the desire to help others. Finally, and perhaps most important, few individuals will contribute tissues that generate financial blockbusters. As a result, compensating such persons in effect rewards them for winning the lottery, whereas the vital mass majority, despite their innate identical contributions, receive nothing. If financial rewards for the development of useful cell lines should be tied to material contributions rather than to luck, then compensation patients such as lack or DF ostensibly in the service of justice may lead to an outcome that may manifestly unjust. That is manifestably unjust. Why might this be an important reason? An ex ante. That's based on prediction rather than results. So why does the author think this might be the most important reason? Although Skloot's book is moving and compelling, we use caution in using the lax example as a model for thinking about compensation patients who provide tissue for research. Although one can point to the many injustices Lax endured as a poor woman without access to the needed medical care, the use of her residual clinical tissue, involving no additional risk or burden to her, does not demand any form of compensation. Furthermore, compensating such patients may have unintended consequences that could work to decrease the availability of tissue for research and may paradoxically become a source of injustice. In the case of DS, we therefore advise the investigators not to offer his family any payments for the use of residual clinical tissue they obtained. How many ideas can you identify that contribute to the conclusion here? Consider whether you find a conclusion justified. Did the article affect your opinion on this issue? And that concludes our reading of the text. Please reach out to your teacher if you have any questions. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.